So Diablo 4 is about to receive a major patch in the midst of Season 1, especially seeing how two classes were pretty severely gutted with the patch just preceding the season. Fortunately, and I suppose it's better late than never, the Barbarian and the Sorcerers are both going to be seeing some significant tuning with the upcoming patch next week. And not only that, but somewhat to our surprise, even some of the other classes that have been performing already quite well are also going to be receiving some love. And so in today's video, I'd like to highlight all the builds that will become much more viable and that you should definitely consider trying out for Season 1 of Diablo 4. And getting into it right away with the Sorcerer, we first got the Fireball Sorcerer, which I think has been a long time coming, especially with how traditionally people have really enjoyed the Fireball slinging power fantasy. The Fireball skill and also Sorcerers in general are receiving a lot of love with this upcoming patch, with Fireball receiving general increases to its explosion radius, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage from not only the skill tree but also the Paragon board and also legendary aspect. But even more notably, and this actually applies to all Sorcerer specs, especially in the endgame, where they especially have been struggling with consistently staying alive, the Sorcerer will be receiving a ton of survivability boosts from mainly their Paragon board, which again addresses endgame survivability via big buffs to their rare nodes and a couple of legendary nodes, and then also even a couple of legendary aspects. And so these buffs will indeed help most if not all endgame Sorcerer builds, especially considering how many builds are already doing quite considerable and competitive amounts of damage, but they just weren't able to really survive well in the endgame. But now that should give Sorcerers a lot more parity compared to the other classes. And just coming back to Fireball really quick, and it's that the Fireball enchantment, which has enemies exploding in a Fireball whenever they're killed, has also been buffed with Fireball itself being buffed, right? Especially if you spec into and allocate points and your Paragon points into all these buffed abilities, your Fireball enchantment from killing an enemy is also buffed at the same time, right? Sort of giving you a double dip in that sense, and also allowing Fireball enchantment builds, especially ones that again invest into these points, to be able to clear and speed farm extremely efficiently. And with that, moving on quickly to our second build I wanted to highlight, and we have the Meteor Sorcerer. And there's not as much to say about this because a lot of the buffs that Fireball received also happen to benefit Meteor, including the legendary aspect called the Aspect of 3 Curses. And so with just these passive buffs to Fireball and Meteor as well as fire passives, alongside the again defensive buffs to Sorcerers, with especially Meteor already doing decent damage pre-patch, this build should become a very strong endgame contender. And for yet one more fire build that's very much worth mentioning alongside these two, we of course have Firewall, which especially combined with the new Season 1 Season Journey aspect that you get basically for free, this could be a decent progression build and even a powerful endgame build too, for similar reasons of course. And next up, for a fan favorite skill from the beta, which is still a good leveling skill, Chain Lightning will be receiving a huge number of buffs from the skill tree and legendary aspects, not only in terms of its damage, notably being able to benefit from not only bouncing off of yourself, but also mana gain, which will receive similar treatment. Again, being able to get you mana from just bouncing off enemies and not just your own character. And next, although these lightning skills didn't receive nearly as many direct buffs as Chain Lightning did, although by the way, the crackling energy mechanic or crackling energy damage also got a slight buff, both the Ball Lightning and Arc Lash Sorcerers should become a lot more viable, especially with the survival buffs that they arguably would benefit the most from out of many Sorcerer builds because of their playstyle, making you generally get quite up close and personal, and thus would benefit the most from these defensive buffs. Very notably as well though, is that if you do decide to go for a orbiting Ball Lightning build, which uses this gravitational aspect, which previously, as I'm showing here because this is the old version, actually decreases your Ball Lightning damage in exchange for having an orbit around your character. After the patch, it will actually turn around and increase your damage, effectively making it go from negative to a positive, which is a tremendous damage increase. And with that, onto the Barbarian, which is the other class that had been nerfed pretty heavily right before Season 1 and is seeing some adjustments and buffs with the upcoming patch. But anyhow, there are in fact still builds that I am very excited to try out with the upcoming patch, starting with the Walking Arsenal Barbarian. This build, as the name implies, will be constructed around the Walking Arsenal key passive, which with the patch will be buffed from a 6-second duration for each buff applying to an 8-second duration. And the way this passive works is you'll want to bind a different weapon to each of your skills to have essentially one of each category of weapons listed on the passive to benefit from all the damage buffs, right? And while there are thus probably a lot of different ways that you can build around this, the version I'm most excited to try is actually the one that Udijo, Diablo content creator, very well known blaster, basically world first leveler created, which primarily uses upheaval, which will also be slightly buffed with the patch, as well as lunging strike, death blow, and iron maelstrom, which is just a really cool skill all around. And of course, I'll put a link to that max roll build in the description box below, and it's also where you'll be able to find links to a lot of the other endgame builds should you decide to go for them. And next, for an underused barbarian skill that is seeing a huge buff, in fact a 25% buff going from a 40% multiplier to a 50% multiplier on the skill itself. Double Swing, I believe, will be a strong contender, and Rob, the Barbarian Master, has also speculated that this will become on par with, if not better than, the current Hoda Barb. And especially considering some further buffs coming to Frenzy from the skill tree, as well as buffs to the Battle Trance Amulet, which will increase attack speed of skills other than Frenzy, Double Swing could be a really interesting and powerful high octane build. And onto a barb build that I think could actually become a lot more popular, especially with how much Blizzard has seemed to be pushing it. We've got the Charge Barb, which not only is receiving significant damage buffs on the skill tree, as well as to vulnerable duration that it grants, but also to the new aspect, the aspect of the Ancestral Charge, which, by the way, you can actually also get from just chapter 1 of the season journey, making it super accessible and one that you can even level with, getting a huge buff from 50 to 100% all the way up to 75 to 150%, and that's per ancient you summon, I assume. So each of them will actually receive that damage buff, making this a huge overall damage increase. Now, before we move on to the next class, I also just wanted to quickly touch on something else about the Barbarian, being the Bleed or Rend Rupture Barb. On paper, according to the patch notes, it looks like this version of Barbarian is also getting a buff with increased damage to Rupture, as well as their unique for Rupture, the Fields of Crimson, seeing some damage buffs, and also getting the cooldown reduction changed to critical strike damage. However, people have pointed out that with this precise change of removing cooldown reduction and changing it to critical strike damage, this could actually result possibly in a damage loss despite all the other buffs that are happening. So just be a bit wary if you're going to be thinking about making or playing a Rupture Rend Barbarian. And with that, onto the Necromancer, which also happens to be the class I'm maining for Season 1. Even though there aren't that many changes coming to the Necromancer with this upcoming patch, especially considering how strong they already are, there are actually a few that are very significant in my opinion, especially first of all for the Sever variant of the Necromancer. Because Sever is getting a lot of buffs from various legendary aspects, being the aspect of the Empowering Reaper, as well as aspect of Decay, which actually also benefits basically all Shadow builds, including Infinimist, Blight, Corpse Explosion variants, and even minion builds with Shadow minions. And also the aspect of Exposed Flesh buff is actually going to be huge for most Necromancer builds that are not Bone or Bone Spear, because previously, whereas it would only benefit Bone skills, after the change, it can actually benefit any Necromancer skill, making skills like, again, Sever and Blight, which are also very spammy spells and essence hungry spells, be able to benefit from this as opposed to having to use the aspect of the Umbral. And with the aspect of the Exposed Flesh, probably giving even more essence generation than the former. And yet another very significant yet somewhat overlooked Necromancer change in my opinion is the fact that minions, being your skeletons, are not going to die nearly as easily, at least according to the patch notes, to certain specific elite mechanics. Prior to this change, even having my Ring of Mandel, which is a godly ring for the Shadow Summoner Necro, as well as just decent gear all around, minions are basically unplayable against certain specific monsters and affixes, such as Fire Enchanted here. They just die too quickly to be able to deal any damage, and you'll also have trouble resummoning them, so it becomes a really large contrast and just a huge inconvenience for any Necromancer utilizing minions, not necessarily just like a minion based build, making them much less viable in my opinion. Just because of the few occasions that you come across these affixes, making things basically completely unplayable. But with these upcoming seemingly simple changes, at least in theory anyway, not only will minion builds become much more viable just because of this, in that you won't have like certain elites that are basically kryptonites to your minions, but other builds can probably also more strongly consider incorporating minions into their build, such as with the Reaper skeletons to generate extra corpses with, and also with skeletal mages to proc additional Shadow Blight procs with. And just speaking of Necromancer builds that utilize the buffed decay aspect as well as minions, potentially anyway, you can also consider checking out my so-called autopilot semi-AFK Necromancer Shadow build that can utilize minions or not if you want. There's lots of ways to pivot the build and build different variants. It's super fun, super convenient with auto cast spells with some of the Malignant Hearts. Be sure to check out my video and have a bunch of fun with the Necromancer. I really recommend this class for Season 1. And lastly, but definitely not least, but also the two classes that received arguably the fewest or least significant changes with this upcoming patch, and for good reason of course, because they're extremely strong already. The Druid and the Rogue, I don't think there's that much to say, nor is there that many new builds per se to actually try with the new patch, as you know, people will still be playing their old viable builds, right? If anything though, just don't fall for some of the traps that they've set, such as with the Companion Druid. Even though Wolves and Ravens were pretty greatly buffed with the patch, they're mainly for the Druid leveling experience and not for endgame nearly as much, right? And the other trap I would say is with the Boulder Druid. They actually buffed the legendary aspect, the aspect of Metamorphic Stone, which basically turns Boulder into a core skill by giving it a spirit cost and also increasing its damage slightly. But because it basically competes with Pulverize as an earth skill if you go for the bear build, and also competes with Landslide for Trample Slide, I really don't see a place for Boulder being a thing unless there's some other build that you can go with Boulder, maybe like a Mimi pushback build or something like that, I'm not really sure. And as for the Rogue, there's nothing too much to be said other than Forceful Arrow getting a buff, and now pierces enemies more frequently and would thus make groups of enemies vulnerable, making it a much better basic skill than before. But besides that, the Rogue is just solid all around, very fast and very powerful, and with lots of variety in its build. So pretty awesome class all around so far. And with that, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know which build you're most excited to play after the patch, or if I actually miss any builds that you think are worth mentioning, be sure to comment down below. Anyhow, thank you so much for watching. Consider checking me out on Twitch at Measley, and also subscribing to my YouTube channel for more cutting edge guides, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.